Oh, hello there. It's Akbar and Adam coming at you from our recording studio. Welcome to episode 9 in our course on the philosophy of climate change. We are in module 2 on climate science. But of course, this isn't a class just on climate science. It's a class in climate philosophy. Ultimately, we're interested in what the science means. What does it imply for what we should do? And so we need to start thinking about how to make sense of the science. And by now we know enough, even on our super cursory look at science as a body of knowledge, climate science as institutions, and climate science as methods and tools. We know that this is extremely complex, and there's a ton of data and information out there, and we need help making sense of all of that. So the question is, who can we trust when we turn for that help? Okay, so that's the topic for today. Before we get that new feature, Akbar's super excited about learning about climate change, as am I. He likes to surf on the web and check things out. And here he found a NOAA site, NOAA being one of our trusted science sense makers in the government realm. And I thought I'd share it with you. The link here is in the slides if you want to follow up. This is a resource for teaching climate literacy. And I kind of compared it with what we've covered so far, and I think we're doing pretty good, actually, if you look at those 7 principles on the right-hand side. Yeah, I think we have kind of a sense of the basics now in climate science. And we know enough, I think, to also realize that we need help making sense of it all, right? So having these basics as a foundation is wonderful, but things like carbon taxes and what to do about fracking and the Green New Deal, whether that makes sense or not. We got to build on that base and digest a lot more information. So we need helpers with that. So that's the topic for today. I want us to think about this need for science sense makers. I have a preliminary, at least, sort of idea about how to formulate a test for their trustworthiness. Again, because we're not experts, okay? We're not mode 1 experts in climate science. And even mode 1 experts in a particular branch of climate science aren't experts in other branches. So we're not able necessarily on our own to determine from the raw data and the methods being used whether something's trustworthy. So we need other tests maybe of trustworthiness. And then I have just a couple of trustworthy science sense makers I want to share with you, and I put a bunch more, about a total of 15 in the notes. It's not a comprehensive list, but it's my kind of go-to list for places to help me interpret, analyze, and assess climate science and its implications for policy. I'll start with a cynical example, and I'll say more about that in a bit. But this is an example of a bad science sense maker, maybe. Then I'll go over this dilemma that we're stuck in, talk about, again, why we're doing climate philosophy, because the climate science, though crucial, is not enough. We build these stories, and how do we do that? The tests that I'm talking about, and then I'll end up on a couple of my favorites, and a note of caution about how trustworthy science sense makers will, at least on occasion, disagree with each other. Okay, so I don't know if you followed this, and the specifics of this aren't important because this is just an illustration. But there was an ongoing investigation conducted by a guy named Robert Mueller into allegations that the Trump campaign had some sort of illegal connections with Russia to help with their election. This went on for a long time, and Mueller ended up producing a report that was huge. It was like 1,000 pages. And this analogy here is like, this is like the climate science, okay? So he came up with this huge report. And then it went to the Attorney General, William Barr, and he sat on it for a couple of days before it went public. And rather than just releasing it to the public, he framed it in a particular way. And he wrote a much smaller sort of overview of the report. And he basically said, this confirms that the Trump campaign did nothing wrong. There was no obstruction. There was no collusion, no problem here, nothing to see. A federal judge later on said that was very dishonest. and not an appropriate or accurate framing of the actual report. Mueller himself complained about this, saying that it didn't give a fair shake to the report. And I guess I don't want to go into it more because partly this is so partisan and polarized. I don't want to dig into it, but just think abstract from this, a lesson that there could be a bad version of science sense making if you had an invested interest in making sure that all of the science was framed to achieve your foregone conclusion, that in this case, hey, nothing to see here, everybody's innocent. Well, that's not a good way, an honest way, a credible, trustworthy way of helping us to make sense of, in this case, a 1,000-page report. But note how the politics of the issue was driven not by the 1,000-page report, because who's going to read that, right? It's just like the climate science itself. Who's reading that? No, it was driven by the framing, the narrative that Barr was able to get out in front and put in on this, okay? So the importance of narrative devices and framing, absolutely crucial. And I say this is a cynical or bad example because this is a framing that arguably was not didn't have much fidelity or correspondence with the actual report underneath it. But the politics then can be driven by appearance only and not reality. So a good science sense maker would be one who stays true to the reality while making a story out of it. Right? That's the difficulty, I think, that we're talking about. So the dilemma. Look, we know climate science is technical, complex, even more than a 1,000-page report. This is multiple 1,000-page reports, right? So that's really hard to make sense of it, and we don't have the time to read all of that, right? Even if we had the expertise to read it all. Yet it is super important for a democratic citizenry to understand climate. Okay, so because the decisions that we make, getting those right, the decisions we don't make have these huge consequences. So we need help understanding the science. Okay, that's kind of summarizing the dilemma. But there's more to it, because in the internet age, in an age of polarized partisan politics, this becomes another point of confusion. You think the science is confusing. Wait till the science gets mediated by the media, by interest groups, by politicians, by non-government organizations, by think tanks, by the web. It's crazy. It's like the Wild West out there. There's disinformation, deliberate propaganda campaigns, misinformation, just bad information, hyperinformation, right? The fire hose. But fortunately, we know enough now to apply some tests to find trustworthy people to guide us through this. Okay, so who are these people? There's many names for them. Explainers, explainer journalists, science policy analysts, data visualizers, just scientists who have a good communication background, communication scientists, climate communication scientists, okay? I'm just calling them science sense makers. The space they occupy is the space between the non-narrative rationality of science, which we've talked about, and the narratives, the stories that drive politics. We all have to make sense of climate science in that we do that by making a kind of story or a general worldview or a picture of what's going on. You know, it's got to be inevitably simpler than all of the data and information. So how do we do that, right? Here, let's put it in terms. Remember, this is the decision process. It's one of the tools I gave you early on. So let's pull it out of our toolbox and see it in this light. So in this case, intelligence is like climate science, or it's like the Mueller Report. Promotion then would be the political process saying, what should we do in light of what we're getting from the intelligence process, you know? And that's where Mueller or Barr got ahead and framed it and said, nah, nothing to see here. And that drove so much then of the political process. Prescription is making actual decision. And then the rest would be implementing it. Right? So just focus on those first three boxes. My point is simply that the decision process, or more broadly, politics, is not a computer. The science is not like a problem that you stick into a computer that's running on an algorithm, a set of instructions that will churn out some sort of objective, automatic result. That's not the way it works. The intelligence, the science, gets thrown into the political arena where people interpret, frame it, assess it, analyze it, make stories out of it, and have these then sort of competing narratives about what to make about it and what to do about it. And that process of making science into stories is unavoidable. I think it's part of the human condition. But it can be done better or worse, right? I try to give you the example, I think, a bad way with Barr, a kind of illegitimate way, maybe. Um, let's try to do it better, right? That's my point with this lecture. So how do you do it? Well, one, as an individual, let's say now, you could be very thoughtless about this. You could say, well, look, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool lefty liberal, and I always get my news from Daily Kos, or I don't know, you name it, the HuffPost, and they're always going to take anything related to climate, and they're going to launder it through this sort of prefabbed framing device, and they're going to chug out something that fits my worldview and confirms my biases. Same on the right. You could say, I'm a die-hard conservative. I always get my news from Breitbart or Daily Caller or Daily Wire, and they're going to do the same thing for me. That's thoughtless consumption of stories. It's just like somebody spoon-feeding it to you. I think we should be more thoughtful about it. So use your own judgment. This is a media bias chart, right? It'd be really nice, I put in the notes, if somebody would come up with a climate-focused version of this chart. Boy, if I had more time, I would do that. And you would put the good science sense makers at the top. So they wouldn't be grinding some partisan axe, and they wouldn't just be churning out simple facts. That's at the bottom, right? So they'd be in the middle, right? Trying to just play it straight with you. And they'd be at the top, meaning they're giving you complex but still digestible, long form, investigative information that gives you a story that's well grounded, right? Okay. Now, preliminarily, the tests I use, this lecture sort of forced me to think, why do I go to the sites I typically go to learn about climate change? And I think this is why. They use peer-reviewed primary sources, and they use these respected, what I call them, primary aggregators like the IPCC. In a way, the IPCC is the mother of all science sense makers because they're not doing the original science necessarily. They're bringing the scientists together to make sense of what is known, right? Another thing to ask yourself, well, are they supported by special interests? Is the fossil fuel industry behind this, right? Right there, you might say, I'm not sure I want to trust these guys, right? Following the money can be hard, though. Worth trying to do, though. Or even if they're not funded by some special interest group, do they always have the same ideological or partisan axe to grind? I'll put a couple examples there. Does it seem like they're always just got a prefabbed conclusion, and no matter what they're analyzing, it just comes to the same result? That's a red flag, I think. And have they earned the respect of other scientists and sense makers or guides, Sherpas through this world? That can be a good test, but we wear a groupthink here. One example I've got to Smog Blog, which would be on that left-leaning end of the spectrum. And I always take what they write with a grain of salt. For example, they have this disinformation page where they say, these are the people you should not pay attention to because they're climate deniers and they're promoting disinformation. Well, on the face of it, that's a helpful thing to do because it's true. There's definitely disinformation out there. But they put Roger Pilkey Jr. in there, and I'll talk about him more in future lectures, but he's not a climate denier. He just said some things that didn't quite fit to Smog Blog's narrative about climate change, but the things he says are well within that consensus position broadly construed. So, these tests are all a little bit squishy. I think they're okay, but they're not going to stop you from the necessity of thinking this through. So when I think it through, I come up with a lot of places I turn. It's a finite number though, right? There's a lot of places I don't turn because I think, well, that's garbage. It doesn't pass the test. But I just, for this one, I just wanted to pick two for you, and I put more in the notes. One is David Roberts here. check his stuff out at Vox, which is where he's at now. He's written for Grist in the past, in other places. I just can't say enough about him as an exemplar of a science sense maker. He's got pieces that are fairly long form. They always cite sources so you can follow up on them. They're well organized by sections, and then further down, subsections, 1, 2, 3. And he just takes a complex issue and he breaks it down for you, and he gives you the places to go to follow up on what he's talking about. To me, it is science sense making in the climate and energy world at its best. So David Roberts, I can't recommend highly enough. And he might be then that kind of model for other science sense makers and say, are they doing something similar to what he's doing? You know. By the way, he wrote this great one in 2012, discount rates, a boring thing you should know about, with otters. So he's got a nice sense of humor. He throws in otter pictures every once in a while. That helps, I think. The other one, and again, there's more I just want to mention, was Carbon Brief, a UK-based group. Zeke Housefather is on here. He's one of my favorites, very well respected across the board in the climate science community, and others on their staff. And they're doing great data visualization, science explainer stuff. So when in doubt, maybe start there. Look at those as models, what they're doing, how they organize it, how they break it down, how they explain it, how they link to their sources. The sources they're using are credible. These are good examples of science sense makers. So when you're building your own story, these are places to go to help you in constructing that. Now, last thing before I switch back and turn this off. This is a piece by Michael Schellenberger. We'll talk about him in the future. He's an eco-modernist. Eco-modernists, in my view, even though people say at the Dismog blog won't like them, in my view, they're in the broad climate consensus. Roger Pilkey Jr. is another example, and Schellenberger. And look, I often find myself grading kind of against what they say, looking for, that can't be right. But you know, they make good arguments, they're well-grounded arguments, and they're worth paying attention to, right? They're smart people. Schellenberger's one of them. And the point is just, he calls out other people I think are smart, like David Wallace Wells. I'm trying to find it. It's down here somewhere. Yeah, here, David Wallace Wells. He's on the list in my notes. I think he's another great person to look to. And he calls out Leah Stokes, who's also in my notes. She's a great climate science sense maker who does these wonderful Twitter threads. But the point is, look, even people who are trustworthy and are doing great at this will disagree with one another. And so you don't get a free pass from thinking, right? You're not delegating your thinking to these people. You're just asking them to help you make sense of this fire hose of information that's out there. So those are my two trusted sources. I'll leave it there. I hope this was helpful. Go out there and see if you can come up with a better test or set of tests than what I've got to think through science sense makers. Let me know who or what organizations you find out there, because I'm constantly trying to build up a trustworthy network of folks and institutions that can help us make sense of climate change. So on that note, as Akbar says, think critically, use the force, and hug a Wookiee, and may the force be with you.